So, during the last few weeks, we've been looking at some of the parables that Jesus used when he was teaching the crowds that came to see him. And in the gospel reading this morning, Jesus was again speaking to a large crowd. But this time, the gospel writers don't record what Jesus was teaching. Instead, they focus and record what happened after he'd finished teaching and healing the crowd. So what we have described is one of the miracles that Jesus performed during his earthly ministry. It's what's known generally as the feeding of the 5,000. And probably one of the most well-known of Jesus' miracles, and the only one that appears in all four of the gospel accounts. But before we start to look into the detail of that miracle, I want us to have a quick look at the context that Matthew places these events into within his gospel narrative. At the start of chapter 14, Matthew records the death of John the Baptist. Herod has ordered John beheaded. And John's disciples come to Jesus to tell him that his cousin and the man who had baptized him had been killed. And Jesus' response to that was to go and sail off alone into a quiet place with nobody about. Now, it may be he wanted to just avoid Herod, but I suspect it was more about Jesus wanting to be alone to deal with the death and the grief of John the Baptist. And I suspect for most of us this morning, we've all gone through some grieving process. We've all lost a friend, relative, loved one. And so we can empathise with Jesus' grief. We're not told how Jesus coped with that grief, just that he needed to be alone. And I think for me, that's a reminder of Jesus' humanity. If we're grieving for the loss of a friend or a loved one, then we're not alone. Jesus has gone through that same experience as a person. Jesus knows and understands all the emotions that come with that loss. That's why when we're grieving, we can bring all those emotions, all those questions that come with that loss. We can bring them to Jesus. But not only that, Jesus wants us to bring all those things to him. Jesus wants to wrap his arms around us and love us in our time of grief. Most of us need time, don't we, to work through loss and grief. But in this case, Jesus didn't really have that opportunity. By the time he arrived at what he thought was going to be a quiet place, to have some alone time, a large crowd had gathered. Now at this point, he could have got back in the boat and gone somewhere else to avoid the crowds. Or he could have told them to go away. I need to be alone. Instead, though, we're told that he was filled with compassion for the people. And this is where we start to see something of what the incarnation looks like. The human part of Jesus wanted to be alone with his grief. But the part of Jesus that's part of God, the Trinity, had compassion on the people. And Jesus responded with that godly compassion. So just moving away from thinking about grief for a moment and taking a more general challenge from this for us as Christians. Do we naturally put the needs of other people before what we want or what we need, like Jesus did in this instance? Are we regularly putting other people's needs first? Because that's at the heart, isn't it, of that second great commandment, to love our neighbour as ourselves. And whilst it's something I aspire to, it's not something I always achieve, to put the needs of others before myself. But we see here Jesus confronted with a crowd of people, and he has compassion on them. So he puts his feeling aside and spends time teaching them and healing many in the crowd who were ill. When we think of this episode, we tend to think the miracle is the feeding of the 5,000, because that's the emphasis that Matthew and the other gospel writers put on the passage. But it's not just that. Oh, I've lost my place now. There's lots of other miracles going on. Jesus was healing many people. Each of those healings was a miracle. So it wasn't just the feeding, it was all those healings as well. And there are plenty of people outside of the Christian faith who deny. And there are other doubts about it. All four of the Gospels is that Jesus performed miracles. One of the problems that the Jewish religious leaders had was that he was actually performing miracles. For example, when Jesus healed, there was no argument as to whether Jesus had actually healed the man. The religious leaders knew that he had. Their problem was that he'd done it on the Sabbath, and that Jesus was becoming popular because people knew he was performing miracles. So we'll look at this event on the basis that the gospel writers are actually recording what had actually happened. In some miraculous way, Jesus did feed 5,000 men, plus women and children. So estimates put that at somewhere probably anything up to 10,000 people, fed with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. We're not told how, because that's not the focus. The focus is that Jesus did feed the crowd that was gathered to see and hear him. The fact that all 4 Gospels contain a description of this event suggests there's something in there that we can learn. And I want to pick up 5 things, just briefly, that we can pick up from this event. The first one is to start with what we have. In verses 16 and 17, Jesus says this: "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. Now, the Gospels are written in a sort of literary style that's narrative prose. So they describe the events that happen. What they don't tell us is what people are thinking. If this was a novel, you'd have an author's sort of aside as to what was going on. But we don't have that. So I wonder what was going through the minds of the disciples. Did they think Jesus was having a laugh, winding them up? A bit of a joke? At what point did they realise that Jesus was actually serious? That his plan was to feed 10,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Jesus wanted the disciples to start from where they were, start from what they had. And the same applies to us today, doesn't it? God wants us to start from where we are today, with what we have and who we are. Our discipleship starts with who we are and with what we have. That opening song, "Come Just As You Are," is a reflection of that, isn't it? Starting here, we work with God, and together we go forward to work out our ministry and our calling before God. I wonder how often do we not do something for God because we use an excuse that we need to do something else in order to be able to do what God wants. We need more experience, more knowledge, more resources, more confidence, be able to pray more, speak better, whatever it is, when God is actually asking us to start from where we are with what God's already given us. What God's given us is already enough for us to start. It may seem vastly inadequate, like the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, but together with God, it is enough. The second thing I want us to think about is to give to Jesus what we have. Verse 18 says, "Bring them," that's the loaves and the fishes, "here to me." In order for anything to happen, the disciples had to hand over the loaves and the fishes to Jesus. It was no use them holding on to them, because if they did that, nothing was going to happen. Handing things over to Jesus may seem obvious, but it doesn't always happen. Are we giving what we have to God? If we put that question in the context of all of Jesus' teachings, then the question starts to become, are we giving everything to God? Everything that we have? Being a disciple of Jesus is not something we do half-heartedly, but it's a full-time, whole-life commitment. One of the prayers that we can use when we give our offering is that everything comes from you and of your own do we give you. Is that the reality of our life with God? Do we acknowledge that everything we have has been given to us by God? It's easy to be misled by the world's attitude that says, I've worked for this, so I deserve it, it's mine. The Bible, though, teaches that we're stewards, not owners of God's creation. If we're holding on to what God has given us, then God can't use it for the purposes that God intended. The third thing we can take from this is that Jesus asked the disciples, bring them, that's the loaves and the fishes, here to me. So the disciples had to bring what they had to Jesus. It may seem obvious that the disciples would do as Jesus asked. After all, if they hadn't, no one had been fed. But equally, at that point, the disciples didn't know what Jesus was about to do. And the Gospels contain examples of people doing and not doing what Jesus asked them to do. And the Old Testament has also many examples of that as well. So one of the challenges we have is, are we doing what God asks of us, even when we cannot see what the outcome will be? Jesus said to the disciples, you give them something to eat. Now they could have looked at the size of the problem and said, it's impossible, and just walked away. But instead, they went with Jesus and did as he asked, step by step, and all the people were fed. Are we the sort of people who come up with excuses as to why we cannot or will not do what Jesus asks of us? Or are we like the disciples who do what Jesus asks, even when we don't understand why, or what we're being asked to do seems illogical or impossible? How much do we trust God? The fourth thing that comes out of that event is prayer. In verse 19, we have, taking the loaves and the 2 fishes and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. We've already said that Jesus is God, and Jesus is God incarnate. And yet time and again we read that Jesus went away and spent time in prayer with God the Father. At the beginning of this passage we saw that Jesus' response to the death of John the Baptist was to be alone. And I think that's so he could spend time alone with God the Father in prayer. And the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes happens after Jesus prays to the Father. And it's a reminder to us of how important it is to be in communication with God through our prayers. And if prayer was important and central to Jesus' life, then it is equally important in our own lives. And the fifth thing that comes out of this event is to be grateful for God's generosity. Verse 20 reads, they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Now Jesus and his disciples could have done what every other rabbi and their disciples would have done in this situation, and sent the multitude home after they'd finished teaching. But God is a gracious God who gives gifts abundantly. The crowd didn't just have a token mouthful of food. Instead, they ate until they were all satisfied. But not only that, there was an excess amount of food left over. This is God's generosity, a generosity that goes over and above what's needed and into abundance. Today in this country, it's with people struggling to pay rent and their power bills, and in countries where there's famine, it can sometimes be difficult to see where God's generosity is. However, if we look about us, if we take the time within this fallen world, where the influence of the devil is still there, we can see God's grace and generosity and abundance present. God's grace and abundance is happening here within this church and in the wider church across this country. And as I was preparing this talk, I was struck by how these 5 areas in many ways apply to what we've been doing with the Beacon. We started with what we were given, an old building and a pot of money that wasn't going to cover what was needed to be done. We gave it all to God so that God could use it as needed. We asked God what he wanted to do with it, and God gave us a vision for that. And now we're in that time of prayer, where we're dealing with the mismatch between the vision and the resources that we have to complete it. However, we know that God is a generous and abundant God and will provide all that is needed to fulfill what it is that God's asked us to do within that project. After all that Jesus had done on that day, from hearing about the death of John the Baptist, to teaching the crowds, to healing the sick, feeding the multitude, what did Jesus do? Well, he didn't have a celebration with the disciples. Instead, he went off again. He went off alone to pray to the Father. It was a day of highs and lows. But through it all, Jesus was focused on his mission and ministry to heal the sick and preach the good news. He was able to do that because he had that close, intimate relationship with God the Father. Our days and our lives can be like that, with highs and lows. But whatever we're going through, God is with us. Whatever God has called us to do, God is with us. And God is still an abundant and generous God. So Tony and the music group are going to lead us in our next song. The eagle-eyed among you who read the copyright notices on the songs may have noticed that all the songs this morning so far were written by Brian Dogson, who passed away and has gone to be with Jesus in the last week or so. So the choice of songs this morning is our homage to him and his contribution to the worship life that we've had as a church and his influence across many churches that have worshipped with his songs. So we go with Faithful One.